Good to see you again, friend. It was good to see you in person just a couple weeks ago in Orlando.
Yeah, and that time has flown fast already since SRS. A lot has happened in the world since then. Yeah, and great to be back again.
Yeah, yeah. I know that you and I and Tom are going to have a SRS wrap up, but one of the things that struck me while we were there and when I was reviewing a lot of the sits that we did while in Orlando was the nationalist mindset that seemed to occur. You know, you were talking about it was a Chinese robot, it was a French robot, it was an Italian robot, it was a Spanish robot, it's a U.S. robot, and so, you know, to sit back there and go, how is that nationalist mindset? And let's assume that they all want to come to the U.S. because that's where they want to come, biggest market there is, so to speak. How does that mindset seem to affect success or lack of success in a U.S. market from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think one of so there's a couple of problems that happen, especially a lot of these robots that come out of things like university settings, and we discussed this before. They're not understanding what the real commercial world is, and they don't understand what it means to try and get into the US, the lift, the size, the scale, the importance of the market, and also the severity of the market. You know, you can't make too many mistakes, so you don't get many bites of the cherry when you come into the US. You know, they'll tell you pretty quickly if your system is good enough or not good enough. So I think one of the problems is that a lot of the nationalistic companies have their own paradigm fairly well sorted for their own country, but then they just get this huge shock when they then come to the US. That's one of the problems.
The and that's really interesting because as I've built these teams, you know, you in your career have been on early stage, of course, but then that commercial lift is always underestimated because people start at the engineering level and say, we've got a robot, let's look for the problem, versus where's the market, let's build a robot to address that market, that workflow, that team, that mindset, that reimbursement, et cetera. So, but one of the things I've seen in my role is I've built all of these tech companies and health tech, and especially the robotics companies, is you're right, it comes out of a university, generally speaking, and that university starts to get this inertia going. And then eventually, once you get past that A round into the B round, you're now starting to say, well, let's start looking at the market. These university level engineers and even maybe device engineers are still running the show, and they're disconnected from the US market, right? The workflow, the team, et cetera. And everything down to drape selection and draping a robot, which is then becomes a pain in the ass in the workflow, in the setting of care. Then what happens, somebody gets a bright idea, usually the investors, and they say, hey, we need somebody in the US. And while the US is there, the communication styles between countries outside the US are always different, even between the UK and the US. The nuances there, like I've got a Jersey client, a UK client who has a team in New Jersey. It's not a robotic company, but it's a complex system. And the communication between those, you would think same language, same culture, you guys birthed us. The friction there, the passive aggressiveness between those two, the teams, the R&D teams, is just insane. And then, you know, do that with Israel, or do that with France, or do that with Italy. And so you get this built-in friction that burns through calories, money, and time. That also is underappreciated.
Yeah, and it's an accumulation of micro differences. This is the thing. It's a little bit the language. It's a little bit the way that you approach things. It's a little bit the way that engineers approach things. You know, engineers in France definitely approach things different than I've seen engineers in California. There's an attitude difference. And then there's a knowledge gap that happens where, in my mind, there's way too many assumptions made from both sides. And especially when if you come out of, say, a Europe, or even it's going to be coming out of China, the knowledge gap between what you actually have to deliver and what you think in your head you have to deliver in terms of functionality, in terms of service, in terms of the way you deliver your commercial model, all those things start stacking up. And that's why you see these sudden car crashes of problems. It's never one individual thing. It's an accumulation. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts is the way that I say it. And and you quite often, the problem with things like a surgical robot is when you get down that path, it's not like tomorrow you wake up and say, "Hey, I think we got it wrong. Let's just flip and change." That's the problem. That's a really big problem.
And that's the point right there. And whether it's even a US developed robot that is addressing the US is once you sort of mint that platform, that system, that commitment to a level. I mean, let's look at, and I don't want to make it the punching bag in the room. Let's look at a Yugo, where that form factor was established 12, 14 years ago. And you couldn't move off that construct, or you could have, but leadership said we've got way too much money and let's keep on putting money at it, right? And then as you make these assumptions, and if the assumptions are off, as you go down range with time, they become really off. And so to your point, you've got cultural differences, you've got engineering differences, you've got marketing differences. You're 80% baked, you think, when you're coming from OUS to the US. You get here, you say, okay, we'll figure it out once we get there. We'll maybe hire a US person to help lead that effort for us. But
Yeah,
the
that
system that's
that
delivering the care is the fault.
yeah, and that I've seen that firsthand. You think to yourself, well, the US team will just work it out for us. And I think on a very low, basic, simple product, I'm sure on a commodity product, there's something they can do. I mean, they can't fix the workflow, right? You can't hire a good US VP of sales who'll suddenly fix the workflow because you're kind of locked into it. And you're locked into it with the way you do the FDA. The FDA often tells you how the workflow is going to work as well. And then the other problem that I definitely see is that, and I can speak as a European. Um, Quite often we see the USA as a big homogenous lump, and we think that San Diego is the same as Boston, is the same as Houston, is the same as Miami. And you as a US would just look at me and say, "You're absolutely bonkers." That's like saying Europe is all the same. I think it's as disparate and sometimes even more disparate in the US when I look across it. So the other problem that people get into is they come to the US when really they should be coming to a group of states and understand each state as well. I think that's a generic problem that you get from the OUS team coming to US.
Yeah, and then you get on top of that, and that's a great point. I've lived in the U.S. my whole life, and I'm a New Yorker, so I kind of speak a different dialect. But there are times when I'm chatting with somebody who's from the deep South, and it I've got to really sit there and concentrate if I'm only hearing them on the phone and I can't actually speak to them, in person. And so you compound that if you're coming from OUS, you say, well, these are the words they said. But then the healthcare systems change from region to region and even state to state as well, which then will drive your reimbursement, which will then impact your financial model. And then your sites of care will change. I've got a friend who runs a really successful ASC on the ortho side down in Houston. He gets paid $1,500 for a joint replacement. The hospital down the block gets $4,500 for the joint replacement. So how do you model that even if you're a US company, that's a challenge. But when you're an OUS company, and I've brought so many OUS companies to the US, they are just not even aware that those struggles are here.
Yeah, and so you see that as well more when it's, for example, UK based companies because they make the presumption that we speak the same language. Okay, that's the first presumption that they make. So how much more difficult and how much more different can it be? And then they get really surprised when they walk in and realize the other thing that I see is that, and I've actually been involved with a lot of companies where they say, well, we're going to go to the US, but they don't realize that for different products, you need a very different entry strategy into the US in a different location. There's certain places that, for example, are better known for taking on innovation than other places that are really, stalwart diehards who, they don't want to change. Won't name which ones they are, but there are different, even by states or even by parts of states where I've seen that technological adoption is just much easier. There's a mentality by the surgeons and by the hospital administration to take on new challenges, new exciting things, whereas others, are more laggardy in the way that they approach it. And all these nuances you can screw up really badly if you're OUS because you only get one bite at the cherry. This is the other thing that I try and tell to people. Spend 80% of your time planning and making sure and verifying and getting it right. Because if you go in, it's very rare that you go in, have a disaster and survive. You know, it's a pretty brutal market compared to many others. So I do try and when I advise people when they go into the US, really understand, is your product fit for purpose for the US market? And is it fit for purpose for multiple states? And of those states, which one should you go to first? And where should you put your beachhead? I mean, it's not a country, it's a continent. It's massive. And I've seen people say, you know, we'll put a logistics center down in Orlando. Okay. And there's your one logistics center in Orlando. And they think they're going to run the entire business across the US out of it. So these are just the misunderstandings that create these problems. And unfortunately for medical devices, especially in a coin operated system, which much of the US is, you don't get two chances. And news travels fast.
Yeah, really fast. And then I want to say, okay, so we identify the challenges, then what could potential solutions be? And then there's one more I want to throw on top of the pile. The number of times a client will come to me and say, we tried to hire ourselves in the US talent, and we got it wrong. We hired this one person, and all they did was collect a paycheck for 6 months, and we didn't realize what they were doing. And they tell me who the person was. I said, well, that wasn't going to be hard for me to figure that out because they've been running that shell game their whole career. Yeah, but they came out of robotics. I'm like, you know, if that was your qualifier, you know, you don't know how to check that lineage of that person and their performance. So you compound that, and people say, yeah, don't worry, I know how to launch that. I know how to take that through. And they get taken a large percentage of the time. And if you're going to launch a robot, you're going to need 6 to 8, conservatively speaking, clinical people there to help surprise, delight, and help get into the, you know, whether you're going to VIP or you're going to Sante or you're going to somebody else, you got to get that right. And then you've got to get that leadership right who's going to lead them. And then you've got to make sure they don't have a poor name, because as soon as they walk into that OR suite or teaching university, they've got a reputation, and then you start, and they're gonna cloak that from you as long as they can and collect that paycheck. It's just human nature. And then all of a sudden you're gonna drop hundreds of thousands of dollars per month, and you're gonna burn through that. To your point, you don't get to make a U-turn on a surgical robot. Okay, so you and I have done the easy thing. We've identified why these things happen. Maybe not so easy, because we still see these venture groups and startups make the same mistakes in the same playbook coming to the US. What would be the guidance we give to these organizations? And let's, I'm gonna be a little provocative, shocker. How about the ones that are just ready to start come to the US right now? So let's go like an SS Innovation, right? They're cooked, they've got a great reputation, they're about ready to come to the US. What should they be doing if they were sitting on the other side of the table with you?
Yeah, so I think there's several things that you can do to minimize risk. You can never eliminate it, right? You don't know till the rubber hits the road. And again, if there's inherently things wrong in your system that don't fit the US workflow, that's going to be hard to overcome. But let's say that the robot can work. I think one of the main things for me is having, you know, building the right team, having the right competencies with the people who genuinely know what they're doing. And to do that, to your point, there's people like yourselves who know who will be the successful people and not just, you know, do a really good interview, which I think is really important. And you need to build that leadership out way ahead of the game. I'm talking a long time ahead of the game, because they need, you know, 18 months to gain momentum on a surgical robot. I think what you've also then got to do is you've got to really decide, you know, one of the most important things is going to be, where are you going to put your office? Where is that going to sit, and why? And what's that office going to be and mean? How is the whole logistics going to work? And these things take 12 months to really work out. There are good services out there that will help you to get good data. And there is one thing about the US that is different than a lot of Europe is there is very good data out there. So if you've got a robot that really kicks it in gynecology and ASCs, you can get that data and understand where those centers are and where that mass of patients are. So at least you're trying to build your business in the right place. Like you don't want it out in the middle of Nebraska, maybe, if that's not the place where, the action's happening. But it just so happens to be where the VP of sales that you hired lives, okay, which is a big problem. So I think, and you have to come at it with a clean slate as well. You can't take what you've learned in Europe and automatically transfer it. And I think that goes across the whole thing. The good clinical experts that you have in the OR in Germany might not be the exact same profile that you'll want for Florida. So I think you've got to go and get a really strong leadership team via an organization like yourselves that can build that team so that you actually get good decision points made. And then, sorry, I haven't gone on here, but the final piece on this is then don't then dictate to them. You've got to let them run with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That right there is golden and probably underappreciated, because if you're going to hire somebody to build that team, you cannot have them pull punches. And you're better off spending a lot more time in your diligence of hiring that person and letting them run, and certainly report back, but letting them run and run hard. And here's the one that's always difficult. When you come to the US, the compensation packages are astronomical compared to any other country in the world. And so the number of times I have to upfront when I'm writing a chief commercial officer role or even a go-to-market role, and they come in with the low ball number. And I said, you can get somebody at that number, not anybody you'd actually hire for real based on the spec. So you've got to come in and you probably want to tremendously increase your budget that you originally planned 3 years ago, because you had no sense of the market. And the market numbers are continuing to be driven up because now these robots are coming here, and the good players justifiably are getting good comp packages coming in. So that is really important, is pick the right person, overpay them because you'll underpay them net at the end, and let them run the game plan. That's so critical.
I think there's nothing frustrates people more than being hired in and then micromanaged. I think that's just, I've seen that time and time again. And again, that's a little bit of a cultural thing as well. In the US, you've got a lot of people, especially the kind of people we want to hire into these companies, are entrepreneurial in terms of their thinking and everything. You can't micromanage them then down to do that. And the second piece of that there is on the micromanagement is, one thing I would say to everybody is set yourself up a very well clear and structured governance system, because you need to know who is responsible for what, who is doing what they can and can't sign off, etc. And you've got to get that really clear up front, because again, there is an ocean. If you're coming out of Europe, there's an ocean that way. If you're coming out of Asia, there's an ocean the other way. And that gulf of time and distance actually makes a really important problem on confusion. So you have to be super clear up front. This is the governance. This is the decisions you can make. This is the decisions you can't make. And let people really understand that. And then let them do the decisions. What you can't do is give them the authority and then undermine them and kick the legs out from under them every time that they do it, because that's just not going to work either.
And that's a really great point, Steve. The governance, and here's the guidelines of things you can, because otherwise it gets bounced back and forth between the organizations, delayed. You're burning through cash every day that gets delayed. It gets compounded. And maybe even more importantly, the esprit de corps of the organization, absolutely, once you lose that and it gets suffocated, you can't resurrect it. And then as the original host country, or not the host country, but the country where it was ideated, where quote unquote leadership now is, you find out way too late, and you'll turn around and you've burned through tens of millions. So that's great insight that I hadn't really thought through. I've experienced it all the time in building these OUS teams that are coming to the US. So that's fascinating. So let's just, before we close up, who are you keeping your eyes on coming out of some of these countries? So out of Japan, Who are you keeping your eyes on right now in regards to the systems?
Yeah, so it's the Medicoroid Hinatori system, which I think is actually a very good system. They've got a couple of features in there. It's very Da Vinci like, but it's not Da Vinci like in other ways. And I think that's interesting because I said this in one of my podcasts. It's their quality is superb, and at the minute, that's what's hindering and hampering a lot of the robot companies is their quality and their reliability. But that with the Kawasaki heritage is just pretty incredible. So yeah, I think Hinatori, but can they culturally, you talk about culture shift, right? Can you take the Japanese culture shift and can you now bring that even into Europe? Just, never mind the US, but can you break that? It all has to be thought and debated in Japan and decided in Japan by the senior management in Japan. If they can't break that, I think they'll struggle. I
Yeah.
think they'll struggle. But it's as a system, I think it's amazing quality.
Got it. How about India? Coming out of India, what are you watching out of there?
Yeah, so I've actually had a chance to get on the SSI Mantra 3. I think it's good, and I think for certain markets, it's going to be really acceptable. If they do get their promise of one third the cost, and I don't mean the price of the robot, one third of the cost per procedures and things, then I think that will be interesting. The big thing that they have that nobody else is really pushing at the minute is the cardiac, and they've got lots of innovation going in cardiac. My one plea to that team was just watch the quality. A little bit, it's like the opposite of the Japanese thing. It's you can't see blue, green, and red wires at the back of a robot while you're using a robot in certain markets like Europe and the US. But I think their innovation is good and their speed's good, and I think that's an interesting one to watch.
South Korea?
Yeah. So interestingly, there's Revo Eye has been on my radar for a long time, and they're sort of re-picking up again. They sort of went through a dip, and they seem to be picking up again now. So I think they've sorted out some of their quality problems. But LivsMed is an interesting company that's got sort of the handheld instruments. Their instruments are very good. I think they may go to do some kind of joint venture somewhere and get their instruments on a robot that's struggling with instruments. I think that could be very interesting.
And there was a player at SRS coming out of Spain, Rob Surgical, and they
Yeah.
made a bit of noise.
Yeah, and that was interesting because I'd sort of written it off in my head. It just didn't register with me at all as anything that good. And then I went to see it, and I was actually more impressed with it than I thought. It's still, it's a big boom robot with a different architecture, but they've got some really clever things in there. Like they've made it so we talked a lot about, how open is your system to having other people's imaging systems. Well, you can put anybody's imaging system on it. I think that's smart because they're not imaging experts; they're robot experts. So that's another really good one that I think is one to watch.
And then finally, the brain trust of watch movement, Switzerland.
Yes. Yeah. So obviously you've got distal motion coming out of there. And I spoke with Greg a while back, and I was very pleased to hear when I asked Greg, are you trying to go wild everywhere? And he was actually very reserved on that and said, we're going to go with a very focused approach. And again, I've lived it myself, and I've seen how you do it right and how maybe you go too wild, too fast. I think if they can do a couple of things, one is stick true and not get their investors push them to just push, get it really focused in and prove out their thesis, which is not the same as most robots. It's not the same as a moon, not the same as a Da Vinci. They've got to prove out their thesis and show that it works. I think that they'll do well. And the second thing that they've got to work on a little bit is, there's a little bit of feedback on the control mechanism, the software control mechanism, and the instruments again, which is going to be the Achilles heel of most companies. But I think if they can fix that, the idea of being able to scrub in at the table and switch between actually has a lot of intrigue for many, many surgeons across the world.
Hmm. Well, as usual, I really enjoy our conversations. I think you said it yesterday on one of the LinkedIn. You and I tend to talk about the things that most people won't, because
Yes.
we don't have anything to protect. Actually, have things to discuss and ask people at least to think about. And I always appreciate your insights into things, Steve.
No, thanks very much. And again, no, you're right. I mean, I think both of us have the same thing at heart, which is we want the tide to take all boats up. And you know, it's sometimes if you shy away from the reality and the truth and don't say it, there's a lot of managers can sit there in a false sense of security. We can say it and we can be wrong, right? We can always be wrong. But at least if it's said, they can think about it and chew on it, and their teams can think about it. And if that triggers something where somebody does something a little bit better, then I think we've done our job.
I agree. I agree. Well, enjoy the heat wave there. I understand that's a warm one. So you're
It
getting
is.
Florida weather. Only we're used to it.
Cool. Thanks very much, Joe. Take care.
You got. Be well. I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.